What would you do if your neighborhood's HOA decided that people like you didn't belong? If they saw your medical equipment, your accessibility needs, not as a necessity, but as an eyesore that needed to be erased? I had spent my career ensuring that no one would ever have to answer that question. For 15 years, I had served as Judge Robert Caldwell on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, specializing in disability rights and housing law. My rulings protected millions of Americans from housing discrimination. But at 48, as my own battle with multiple sclerosis progressed, I never imagined I'd become the victim of the very injustice I had spent decades fighting. After my wife Maggie passed away suddenly from a stroke, our sprawling family home felt unbearably empty. The long hallways, the towering staircase, it wasn't practical anymore. My MS had been steadily weakening my mobility for years, and though I still had full mental sharpness, my body had begun betraying me. I needed a home where I could maintain independence, not just for a few months, but for the years to come. That's what led me to Suncrest Estates, a gated luxury community just outside Phoenix. It marketed itself as a paradise for retired professionals, offering single-level homes, gentle sloping entryways, and wide doorways, the very features that made it sound perfect for someone in my condition. I had done my due diligence. Before purchasing, I had meticulously reviewed the HOA regulations, ensuring that federal law would protect my rights to make reasonable accessibility modifications. My realtor, Diane Harper, even arranged a meeting with an HOA representative, who assured me that accommodations for medical needs were routinely approved. It took less than 24 hours to learn that was a lie. Before the moving company had even finished unloading my boxes, I found a crisp white envelope taped to my front door. Violation notice, unauthorized exterior modification. I frowned, unfolding the letter. It cited my accessibility ramp, the one I had installed before even moving in, as a violation of Suncrest's community aesthetic standards. The next morning, she arrived. Valerie Harmon, HOA president. Immaculately dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, dark hair pulled back into a severe bun, manicure flawless. She clutched her clipboard like a weapon. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Judge Caldwell, she said smoothly, voice dripping with artificial warmth. I wanted to personally welcome you to Suncrest Estates and discuss your situation. I already knew where this was going. I explained, calmly, that federal law protected my right to accessibility modifications. I cited the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and even her own HOA bylaws, which permitted reasonable accommodations for medical needs. Her smile tightened. With all due respect to your former position, she said, emphasizing former like a knife between my ribs, our residents choose Suncrest because we don't look like a medical facility. I had spent my career recognizing patterns of discrimination. The moment she said it, I knew exactly who I was dealing with. And I knew, in that moment, that this was not going to be a legal debate. It was going to be a war. I had spent years in courtrooms dissecting manipulative language, the kind designed to sound reasonable while concealing something far more insidious. I recognized the pattern instantly. Valerie Harmon wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She was calculating. She had already decided that I didn't belong, and now she was laying the groundwork to force me out. But what she didn't realize was that I had no intention of leaving. I immediately contested the violation, filing a formal request for reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. By law, the HOA was required to review the request and provide an official ruling within 30 days. They didn't. Instead, they delayed the hearing 3 times over the next 2 months, each time citing technical issues or scheduling conflicts. And while I waited, the violations multiplied. The first fine came 2 weeks after my initial appeal. Unapproved landscaping modification, $75 daily fine. Apparently, my garden beds, the same ones that were already here when I purchased the house, were a problem. Days later, another letter. Unauthorized exterior lighting, $50 daily fine. This time, they were targeting my small solar pathway lights, which helped me navigate my property safely at night. Then came the big one, a violation for unauthorized commercial vehicle parking. I didn't own a commercial vehicle. I owned a wheelchair-accessible van. I called my attorney, Sandra Chong, who wasted no time filing an official complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office. But these cases took months to process. In the meantime, I was bleeding thousands of dollars in fines for infractions that were being selectively enforced against me. And then, it got worse. One morning, I woke up to find that my water pressure had dropped to almost nothing. My sinks dribbled. My shower was unusable. When I called the community maintenance office, I was told it was a pipe issue affecting multiple homes. But a few conversations with neighbors confirmed what I suspected: no one else had this problem. Then, the landscaping crew accidentally damaged my accessible garden beds, tearing up the plants and churning the soil into a muddy, unusable mess. And if that wasn't enough, HOA security started showing up at my home late at night, knocking on my door under the guise of wellness checks. The first time, they claimed they'd received a report of strange noises coming from my house. The second time, it was suspicious activity in my driveway. They weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to wear me down. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I started documenting everything. I installed security cameras around my home and kept detailed logs of every interaction. And then, the first truly dangerous escalation happened. It was a Tuesday morning when I rolled into my van, intending to drive to a legal mediation meeting Sandra had arranged with the HOA's lawyer. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. I called a mechanic, assuming it was a battery issue. But when he arrived, his expression darkened as he examined the undercarriage. "Judge Caldwell," he said grimly. "You're lucky this van didn't start. Your brake lines were cut." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was attempted murder. Sandra called the police, and while they took the matter seriously, they told me there was no security footage of the culprit. That night, however, I received an anonymous tip. A man's voice, low and anxious. "I need to talk," he said. "I know what happened to your van." His name was Chris, a young father who lived 3 blocks away. He owed the HOA thousands in overdue fees and was on the verge of losing his home. He told me that Valerie had made him an offer: if he handled my van, his debt would disappear. Chris was visibly shaking when he admitted what he had done. "She told me you were just some rich guy causing trouble," he whispered. "She said you were suing the HOA to get out of paying fines. She never told me you were disabled. She never told me this was your only way of getting around." I could hear the regret in his voice. But regret wouldn't have saved me if I had driven that van. I recorded everything. Chris agreed to testify, and Sandra immediately added this to our growing case against the HOA. That was the night I realized Valerie Harmon wasn't just trying to make me leave. She was trying to ruin me. And I knew that if I didn't stop her, she would do this to someone else. So I did what I always did when I was preparing for the biggest cases of my career. I started building an airtight legal assault that would leave her nowhere to hide. And when I was done, she would wish she had never picked this fight. Valerie Harmon had crossed a line. The moment my brake lines were cut, this stopped being about fines and violations. This was an all-out war of attrition, and I wasn't backing down. But Valerie wasn't finished either. If she couldn't force me out through intimidation and harassment, she'd try something else. Something even more sinister. She was going to destroy my reputation. It started subtly. A few cold glances from neighbors who used to greet me with polite smiles. A woman pulling her child away as I passed by in my wheelchair. Then came the whispers. I caught my name murmured at the community center, but every time I turned to confront them, the conversations would dissolve into awkward silence. Then the emails started. Valerie had sent out a community-wide newsletter, warning residents about inappropriate behavior from an unnamed new homeowner. She never used my name, but the details, a single man, recently moved in, known for his past legal work, were specific enough that there was no mistaking who she meant. I was being framed as a predator. A week later, an official complaint was filed with the HOA board. A young woman, Amanda Parks, Valerie's 26-year-old secretary, accused me of harassment. She claimed that I had followed her to her car, made lewd comments, and lingered outside the HOA office. It was a lie. A calculated, vicious lie. Sandra immediately demanded proof. The HOA office had security cameras. If I had done anything inappropriate, it would be on tape. But when we requested the footage, we were told that the cameras had been malfunctioning that week. That was when I knew. Valerie had manufactured this entire story. But she made one mistake. She had tried to edit reality, and I had my own cameras. 2 weeks earlier, I had installed surveillance cameras around my home after the brake line incident. One of them pointed directly at the HOA office parking lot. I had the footage of that exact day, and it proved Amanda's story was false. Not only had I never spoken to her, but in the moment she claimed I had followed her, I was clearly seen wheeling into my van and driving away in the opposite direction. The next morning, I sent the unedited footage to Sandra. That afternoon, she filed a formal defamation lawsuit against Valerie and Amanda. It didn't take long for Amanda to crack under pressure. Confronted with perjury charges, she admitted everything. Valerie had pressured her into lying. I thought that would be the end of it. That with Valerie's scheme exposed, she would finally back down. I was wrong. Because later that week, as I tried to focus on my legal strategy, a new violation notice appeared on my doorstep. Unauthorized medical equipment, emergency removal notice. I felt a cold wave of dread as I read the details. They were trying to remove my hot tub. My doctor had prescribed hydrotherapy to help with my worsening muscle spasms. I had installed a small, portable hot tub in my private, enclosed patio. It was completely hidden from view, invisible to the street and my neighbors. But Valerie had found out, and she had declared it a health hazard. I barely had time to react before my security system alerted me to movement in my backyard. Through the glass doors, I saw 2 uniformed maintenance workers stepping onto my patio, tools in hand. Leading them was Valerie. I pushed myself into motion, rolling toward the door as fast as my chair would allow. By the time I made it outside, one of the workers was already reaching for the tub's control panel. "You are trespassing on private property," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This is illegal, and I want you off my land, now." Valerie turned toward me, eyes filled with cold amusement. She extended a piece of paper, a printed notice from the HOA board. "This is a mandatory abatement order," she said, waving it like it held actual legal weight. "Your unauthorized hot tub violates 3 community covenants, and I have the authority to enforce removal." I took the paper from her hand, scanning it quickly. It was bogus, a fabricated excuse to harass me further. "This is a medical device," I said, holding up a folder containing my doctor's prescription. "Under the Fair Housing Act, you have no legal authority to remove it." Valerie didn't even glance at the documentation. Instead, she snatched the folder from my hands, tore it in half, and tossed the pieces to the ground. My pulse spiked. "You are breaking the law," I said, forcing myself to remain calm. "You cannot." "I can do whatever is necessary to keep this community from turning into a nursing home," she snapped. The maintenance workers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. One of them, an older man, shifted nervously. "Miss Harmon, this really doesn't seem right. It's medical equipment. We should." "I am the authority here," Valerie barked. "Do your jobs, or I'll find people who will." When neither man moved, she let out a frustrated growl. Then she stormed toward their truck. And when she returned, she was holding a sledgehammer. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then she lifted it over her shoulder. "Fine," she spat. "I'll do it myself." The first swing shattered the control panel. The second sent a crack through the fiberglass shell. I felt frozen in place, watching in horror as she destroyed my medical equipment with terrifying precision. I had never seen someone so consumed with hatred. I struggled to move forward, but my hands were shaking too hard to control my chair properly. "Valerie, stop!" I shouted. She ignored me. I heard shouting, neighbors were coming outside, some gasping, some already pulling out their phones to record. A younger worker stepped back, horrified. "We should call the police." "Do not call the police," Valerie snapped. "This is HOA business." Then she turned toward me, gripping the sledgehammer with both hands. "This is what I think of your special accommodations." She lunged toward my wheelchair. I barely had time to react. The metal cracked with the first blow. The second strike shattered my control panel. The third. My will buckled, and suddenly, I was tipping sideways, falling hard onto the pavement. Pain exploded through my hip. I could hear the gasps of neighbors. The distant wail of a siren approaching. I looked up just in time to see Valerie raising the sledgehammer again. Her face was twisted in fury. I closed my eyes, bracing for the final blow. But it never came. Because at that moment, a voice boomed through the chaos. "Drop the weapon and step away." I turned my head, vision blurred with pain, just in time to see the police arriving. Valerie's face paled. Because that was when she realized exactly who she had been attacking. And that she had just committed a federal hate crime. The moment the sirens wailed through the neighborhood, the weight of what had just happened seemed to settle over everyone. Valerie stood frozen, sledgehammer still gripped in her manicured hands, her expression flickering between rage and realization. Around us, neighbors had gathered, some holding up their phones, recording every second. Some murmured in horror, others in hushed vindication. A uniformed officer stepped out of the patrol car, hand resting near his holster. Officer Eric Martinez, according to his badge. His gaze landed on the shattered remains of my wheelchair, then flicked to me, sprawled on the pavement, struggling to breathe through the searing pain in my hip. His jaw tensed. "Step away from the wheelchair and put the sledgehammer down," Martinez ordered, voice firm. Valerie's grip tightened, fingers flexing as if she were considering her next move. Her mouth opened, then closed. She wasn't used to being challenged, not by residents, not by law enforcement. She was used to winning, to getting away with things under the guise of HOA rules. Finally, she let the sledgehammer fall from her hands. It clattered against the sidewalk, sending a metallic echo through the quiet street. Martinez's partner approached me, kneeling down. "Sir, are you injured?" I nodded, forcing the words out between shallow breaths. "Hip. Think it's broken." Another officer crouched beside me, speaking into his radio. "We need medical assistance at the scene. Victim is a disabled male, appears to have sustained a serious hip injury from a fall." Martinez turned to Valerie, his face unreadable. "Ma'am, we're going to need to have a word with you." Valerie lifted her chin, regaining some of her composure. "I was enforcing HOA regulations," she said, her voice clipped, almost indignant. "This man was in clear violation of community standards, and I had full authority to remove." Martinez held up a hand. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to stop talking." He gestured toward the broken wheelchair. "You destroyed this man's property with a sledgehammer." His gaze flicked to my fallen form. "And from what I can see, he was in that chair when you started swinging. Valerie faltered, eyes darting toward the growing crowd of residents. Her hands trembled slightly, as if she finally grasped how badly she had overplayed her hand. Martinez exhaled sharply. "Ma'am, do you know who this is?" For the first time since this all began, real fear flickered in her expression. She hesitated. "He's Judge Robert Caldwell," Martinez cut in, voice heavy with something like disbelief. "Former Ninth Circuit Court judge. The man who literally wrote the controlling legal precedent on disability housing discrimination." Valerie went pale. The weight of the moment hit her like a freight train. I watched it happen in real time, the way her lips parted slightly, her eyes widening as the realization sank in. She had attacked not just any disabled resident, but the very person who had shaped the legal protections she had just obliterated in front of half the neighborhood. "This is absurd," she snapped, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "This is being blown out of proportion. I was merely—" "No," Martinez cut her off, his voice colder now. "What you did wasn't just property damage. It wasn't just assault. Given the statements from witnesses, your prior history of targeting disabled residents, and the audio recordings that we'll be reviewing," he let the words sink in. "You may have just committed a federal hate crime." A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. Some gasped. A few exchanged satisfied glances, as if they had long waited for this moment. Valerie's mouth opened, then snapped shut. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice losing some of its usual authority. "I was just trying to maintain order in this community." Martinez shook his head. "Maintaining order doesn't involve beating a disabled man's wheelchair into scrap metal." He turned to his partner. "Cuff her." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists was one of the most satisfying things I had ever heard. As they read her rights, Valerie looked around wildly, as if expecting someone to intervene, to come to her defense. But no one moved. She had ruled this neighborhood with fear for years. But fear only lasts until people see the bully fall. She had picked the wrong person to try and destroy. The paramedics arrived moments later, carefully transferring me onto a stretcher. Every movement sent a fresh wave of white-hot agony through my hip, but I forced myself to stay focused. As they wheeled me toward the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of Valerie being placed in the back of a squad car, her pristine navy blue suit rumpled, her perfectly controlled mask slipping. She turned to me just before they closed the door. For the first time, she looked afraid. And for the first time in months, I felt something other than exhaustion and frustration. I felt victory. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the ambulance doors closed, I reached for my phone with unsteady hands. I had 3 calls to make. First, to Sandra, to file an emergency civil rights injunction against the HOA. Second, to James Mitchell, the U.S. Attorney for Arizona, who had been my former law clerk and now had every reason to push for a federal hate crime investigation. And third, to Olivia Warren, the journalist who had covered my disability rulings before. By morning, the world would know exactly what Valerie had done. And she would never get away with it. The story of Valerie Harmon's downfall spread faster than I could have imagined. By the time I woke up in a hospital bed, recovering from hip replacement surgery, my phone was already buzzing with messages. National news outlets had picked up the story. The video of Valerie smashing my wheelchair with a sledgehammer had gone viral overnight, and the reaction was immediate and furious. HOA presidents and board members across the country suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Disability rights organizations saw a 300% increase in housing discrimination complaints, and state legislators started calling for stricter HOA regulations. What had happened in Suncrest Estates was not an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a larger problem. Meanwhile, the fallout for Valerie was swift and merciless. Investigators uncovered her fraudulent real estate scheme, how she had systematically harassed elderly and disabled residents, forcing them to sell at below-market prices, then flipping their homes for profit. Over 5 years, she had pocketed nearly $2 million. The fraud, combined with civil rights violations, wire fraud, and a federal hate crime charge, meant that Valerie wouldn't just be facing a lawsuit, she was looking at serious prison time. At her trial, she tried to defend herself, claiming she had been only following community standards. But when confronted with emails she had sent board members, which included phrases like undesirable demographic shifts and better one family moves than we all suffer, even her high-priced attorney couldn't save her. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. She was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, along with a court order to pay $4.2 million in restitution. But justice didn't end with her conviction. With her gone, the HOA was dismantled, and Suncrest Estates was transformed. A new community board, led by residents like Michael Reynolds and Claire Wilson, worked with disability rights advocates to restore accessibility features that had been erased. Property values rose by 12%, proving that inclusivity didn't hurt neighborhoods, it strengthened them. As for me, I used my settlement money to establish the Caldwell Foundation for Housing Equity, offering legal assistance to disabled homeowners fighting discrimination. Within the first year, we helped over 300 families nationwide push back against HOAs that tried to bully them into silence. The image of Valerie standing over my shattered wheelchair, sledgehammer in hand, became a symbol of HOA overreach and the fight for disability rights. And every time I saw it, I remembered exactly why I had fought so hard, not just for myself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Because the truth is, HOA bullies like Valerie exist everywhere. And while most don't take a sledgehammer to a wheelchair, their tactics, fines, intimidation, legal loopholes, are just as damaging. So I'll leave you with this: have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or a Karen who thought they ruled the neighborhood? Share your experience below, let's see who had it worse.